Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to another Reddit Stories video. Today we're diving into some of the most disturbing and twisted horror stories Reddit has to offer. And trust me, these are the kind of stories that will stick with you long after the video ends. If you love creepy, unsettling tales, you're in the right place. Thank you so much for stopping by. I appreciate every single one of you watching. Let me know in the comments if you want more Reddit horror or if there's something different you'd like to see. And hey, the channel's goal is 10,000 subscribers. So if you enjoy this, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. It helps more than you know. All right, without further ado, let's get into these deranged stories. I clean abandoned houses, and this house is still haunting me today. Just as the title states, I clean abandoned houses for a living. I'm quite proud of myself as I have worked hard starting my own business at just 24 years old and building it to what it is now. I specifically targeted these types of cleaning jobs as you can charge much more than your average 1 to 3 times per week house cleaning jobs of inhabited homes. Plus, I rarely ever have to see anyone other than my team while on the job. Over the years, I have really been in some insane situations with these houses. Everything from encountering wild animals to once a deranged squatter taking up residence in the homes I clean. There's one house that stands out from the rest, however. One that haunts my dreams to this day. I got the job offer through a real estate agent I made my friend over the years in this business. It's a small home, not much clutter left. Amela, my real estate friend, said over the phone, "Shouldn't need more than 1 or 2 of you to complete the clean," she continued in her enthusiastic voice. I rolled my eyes. I hated when she used her customer service voice on me. Yeah. What's the real deal with this house?" I answered in my usual half-annoyed tone. Amelia responded more normal this time. "Honestly, Lori, this house gives me the creeps. The granddaughter inherited it a couple of years ago, but has just recently decided to sell. The grandmother apparently died in the house." I rolled my eyes again. Death in the houses I cleaned was nothing new to me, and Amelia was well aware of this. Amelia continued, "I cut my pre-visit to the house short last week. Didn't even make it upstairs where the grandmother apparently passed. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming in this one. That got my attention." Amelia had been in real estate longer than I had been in the cleaning business, and she took her pre-get-to-know-before-showing visits very seriously. "Anyway, I recommended your cleaning services to the granddaughter and she agreed right away." "Do you accept?" she finished. "Yes, I accept the job. How soon can we get in to clean?" I answered, feeling somewhat excited. "Tomorrow at 8 a.m. As I mentioned, the granddaughter removed most of the clutter from the house, but it still needs a good TLC cleaning. The key will be left under the welcome mat," Amelia said, back in her customer service voice. My eyes rolled yet again as I ended the call. Finally, an interesting clean, I thought, as I then dialed Morgan. The next day, my most trusted cleaner and best friend, Morgan, and myself drove up the horribly overgrown driveway and saw the well-aged small house come into view. Surely, they will need to hire an outside maintenance and renovation crew, I thought, as I climbed out of my cleaning van. Morgan whistled as we stepped on the small creaking porch. "You sure just you and I can handle this, Lori?" Morgan asked as I fetched the house key from the weathered porch mat. "If the outside is anything like the inside, we need the whole damn team," Morgan stated as she stood behind me. "Amelia is over the top, but would never underestimate a cleaning job," I answered as I slid the house key into the old lock and turned until I heard the lock give way. I then pushed the door open as it made the usual ominous creak. We were both silent as we stepped into what I assumed was the small living room. The musty smell of a far too long closed-up house filled my nose as my eyes scanned the darkened room. Just as Amelia said, not much was left in the room. A couch took up most of the room on the right. A small wooden coffee table sat directly in front of it, coated in a thick layer of dust. I noticed a few photographs still clung to the walls. "Let's get the supplies from the back of the van and get started," I said over my shoulder to Morgan. "I have dinner plans and want this done long before." A bit later, I was scrubbing the dirty windows of the living room while Morgan opted to start upstairs. "Lori," I heard Morgan call from up the stairs located just behind me. "What?" I called back. It was silent for several minutes as I waited for a response. I felt my aggravation growing as Morgan did not respond. I threw my rag on the floor and wiped my sweating brow as I turned and headed towards the stairs. Each step groaned beneath my feet as I climbed to the upper floor. "You better have a damn good reason for interrupting me and not answering," I yelled as I reached the final step. Goosebumps covered my skin when I stepped onto the old wooden floor of the upper level. Weird, I mumbled to myself as I looked around. The upper level was a small hallway. 2 rooms were located on each side as I peered down the dark corridor. "Morgan?" I called in a softer voice this time. No answer. I slowly headed down the hallway, wishing I had thought to bring my flashlight. I always hated working with no electricity, but it came with the job. I could see the light of day from the open door on the left side of the hall. The other door on the right was closed. As I looked into the open door on the left, I saw Morgan standing still looking at the bed located on the far side of the room. "It moved," Morgan said in an almost whisper. "Huh?" I answered as I walked in and stood beside her. "The bed. It moved on its own while I was cleaning the floor," Morgan said, still staring down at the bed. I then noticed the bed was crooked now. The bottom was several inches away from the wall, where the top was still flush with the corner of wall. "Do you see it?" Morgan then said, even softer now. I almost couldn't hear her. Instead of questioning her, I looked down towards the bed that her eyes were glued to. I instantly saw what she was talking about. There was an imprint on the bed, the shape of a body, as if someone was laying on the bed that very moment. The chills were really covering my body now, and I felt myself actually shivering. It felt like someone was staring up at us directly from the bed. I slowly reached for Morgan's arm and gently pulled her towards me. "Let's go back downstairs. We will finish the bottom floor together," I said, matching her whispering tone. Morgan didn't respond, but obeyed my request. The feeling of eyes on us did not leave as we headed down the small hallway to the top of the stairs. I had to fight the urge to run down the flimsy steps. Once we were safely down in the living room, the air somehow felt easier to breathe, if that makes any sense. "What the hell was that?" Morgan demanded, finally sounding more like herself. I ignored that question. "Look, you know I hate skimming on jobs, but let's get this level done and get the hell out of here." I grabbed my cleaning supplies and headed to the next room, which was a small kitchen. Morgan stayed close beside me as we worked in silence, cleaning the sink, counter, and cabinets. We both froze after hearing what sounded like footsteps above us. "Don't," I said in a warning tone as I went back to cleaning dust and mice droppings from the cabinet. Morgan again obeyed and stayed silent as she went back to work on the counter. The footsteps continued moving around above us on and off as we quickly finished in the kitchen. The last room branched off from the kitchen that appeared to be a small office. I was so relieved we would be out of there soon. This room had stained and worn down carpet covering the wooden floor. I turned on our rechargeable vacuum, and the loud buzzing sound almost deafened me, but I was glad for it. Working in eerie silence was not normal for us, as we usually chatted and listened to music, but I was too rushed to fool with conversation or a playlist right now. "What the actual hell?" I heard Morgan yell out over the sound of the vacuum. I jerked my head up to see Morgan staring up at the ceiling, looking terrified again. Just as I cut the vacuum off, I heard what she had to be referring to as the buzzing sound died down. I can only explain it as the choking or coughing, gurgling sound of an elderly person. It was only for a split second I heard it, but that was enough. "Screw this!" I yelled as I grabbed up as many of our supplies as I could. Morgan joined me in grabbing up the rest. We dashed out of the office, through the kitchen and living room, and out the front door. I was pretty much sprinting to the van while trying not to trip on the mess of the yard. Just as I got to the van, I heard Morgan shout, "Wait!" I turned to see her a few feet behind me. I left my supplies upstairs. We also didn't finish cleaning up there. We didn't even clean the bathroom, which must be up there. I'm not charging the freaking client. We can buy new. Whatever supplies are left, get your ass in the van. I didn't wait for a response as I jumped into the driver's seat. Morgan hurried and threw the supplies in her arms in the back and slammed the door. I took one final look at the house as she slid into the passenger seat. I couldn't be sure, but it almost looked like someone was peering out of one of the two upper windows. I started the van. Hearing it roar to life was pure heaven in that moment. I floored it out of the driveway and back into town. I later called Amelia to explain the job was not complete and I would not be charging. The granddaughter would have to find someone else to clean that nightmare. This has been a couple of months ago, and I was not kidding when I said this horrid house still haunts my dreams. It was only last night I dreamt I was in a bed, staring up at an old, cracked, and familiar ceiling. I felt weak and frail as the weight of someone crawling on top of me took the air from my lungs. I felt cold hands around my throat squeezing tighter and tighter, that awful gurgling, choking sound coming from my mouth being the last thing I heard as I woke up in a cold sweat. The marks are still visible on my throat today. I thought I saw my ex in the window, but it wasn't her. I realized there was a ghost in my window after my ex moved out. I was slumped in my couch alone, and then, you know how you feel when someone's staring is at you and look over and someone actually is? That happened. I could feel eyes on me. I looked around and there she was, her reflection in our 5th floor apartment window. I stood up. I might have cried out from fear. I don't remember. I went over to the window, which looked over a narrow alley and snowy roofs. Our apartment building was in a street mostly with townhouses. Anyway, the face in the window didn't budge or blink, just stared. I stared back. I couldn't tell if the face was outside the window or in the window, if that makes sense. On impulse, pushing the limp curtains fully aside, I opened the window. Wind howled in from the street-lit darkness. I quickly pulled the window close again. Her face glimmered back into the glass, backlit from the streetlight. And then I noticed, I'm not a noticing sort, but I noticed her hair. It was all done up fancy, and there were lights, no sparkles like jewels in her hair, a trail of elaborate sparkles running from the tops of her ears towards the back. And then as I stared and she stared back, tears running down her pale cheeks, it clicked. She was a bride. She was done up similar to girls at their weddings. We had been to a wedding a few months back, and I remember the hair and the sparkling jewels curving around the bride's forehead. Pretty. The girl opened her mouth, and I remembered my living room was haunted. I reached my hand to the window. She also raised her hand, and through the ice touch of the glass, I felt her fingers, warm and reassuring. The warmth of her fingers was the first thing that ignited actual fear in me. It blazed in me as my eyes stretched wide open, and the blaze burned my fog of heartbreak and confusion and made me see clearly. The girl in the window wasn't my ex, a silly fancy in my mind. In fact, looked nothing like her, but a supernatural, sad bridal creature, haunting me. I snatched my hand away and leapt back. The woman's face shone brightly in the glass, and she smiled. Her painted lips moved. "Let me in, Charles. I'm so cold." I blinked. How could I? What did she mean? On impulse, I pulled the curtains, which had been hanging back close together, and collapsed back on the couch. I realized I was sweating, and very soon after, a great wave of fatigue pulled me under, and I fell into the deepest slumber I have ever known. I forgot to think about my ex much the next day. Occasionally, the bride's face in the window swam into my mind. I didn't feel much fear anymore, and towards the end of the day, I found myself wondering if she would still be there. She was. We stared at each other. Our fingers touched through the glass. "Let me in." Her words glided into my brain. "I can help you. I know how you feel." My brain jerked. I snatched my fingers away and let the curtains fall. How could she know how I felt? The huge fatigue welled up in me again, and the image of the face, the last thing I saw before everything went black. The next day was Saturday. For the first time since the breakup, I was happy it was a Saturday, and the day didn't loom pointlessly in front of me. I went straight to the local library, which I hadn't visited since childhood, and dove into the local archives. In an hour or so, I had found what I needed to know. My building was built on the site of a large old house. About 50 years ago, a young bride had jumped out of a balcony to her death after the groom-to-be jilted her the morning of their wedding, a sensational local news story. I stared at the young, sad face of the bride in the digitized old newspaper, the same face that looked at me from my window every night, asking to be let back in. But even if I wanted to, How could I? That evening, I flung the window open, hoping to be rid of her longing stare into my soul. And there was nothing, just the street night glare and icy rush of window. The moment I pulled the window shut, she shone into the glass. Let me in, Charles. I can help you. I know how you feel. They say you get used to everything, and soon I got used to that sad, sparkly face in the window, yearning to come in, claiming to help me. And even though I couldn't bring her back in, I think maybe she was helping me, because I seemed to be thinking about my ex and the breakup less and less. I resumed my usual gym routine, and a few weeks after that visit to the library, I gave in to the insistence of my friends to set up a new dating profile. Very soon after that, I found myself going out on coffee dates, which then progressed to dinner dates, and from there to do you want to come back to my place dates with lovely Helen. As we settled on the couch, I turned and pulled Helen close to me, savoring this new romantic bliss. A shine caught my eyes and my eyelids fluttered opened. I glimpsed the face in the window over Helen's shoulder, the sparkle and shine of her eyes and teeth and the jewels in her hair and the streetlights dazzled me. I jerked away from Helen and cried out. How could I have forgotten about her? Helen smiled politely at me. What's wrong, Charles? The curtains, I muttered and stood up and walked over to pull them close. The face came up so close I could feel the warmth of her skin. Now, Charles, she begged. Let me in now. Without thinking, I pulled the window open. Icy air whooshed in. Just want a breath of fresh air. I heard myself explaining to Helen, who seemed quite motionless on the couch. I went back to the couch and settled next to her. Helen? I placed my arms around her, pulling her towards me. And then I saw the sparkles in her hair, the jewels tucked in an elaborate and familiar pattern around her ears and curling back. I cried out in horror, reeling back. The face from the window was superimposed on Helen's lively, pretty features. Oh, Charles, it's so warm here. Never let me back out. Helen? I cried, horrified at what I had done. I grabbed her shoulders and started shaking her. Helen, listen to me. I shook her again, and she smiled at me, lying back on the couch, her face another's. I took her by the hand, yanked her to her feet, dragged her to the window, and flung it open. Out! Out! I cried, and we tussled in the rush of cold, black air. Her hands were strong on mine, pulling me through the window. All the lights and sparkles seemed to turn upside down, and suddenly I was dangling outside with nothing beneath me. My hands gripped the railing, and I could feel a force greater than gravity pulling me down. Charles! Screamed Helen. I looked up at her, and she bent towards me, her face her own. Hold on, she gasped, and she pulled at me. I was able to climb up and crawl in, gripping her arms. I heard her cries of pain, but she remained steady. Once in, I immediately slammed the window shut, and we collapsed, entwined and panting on the floor. After a while, we got up. Helen said casually she's going to put the kettle on for a cuppa. It sounded like a good idea, and I said I wanted one too. As I followed her into the kitchen, I looked back at the living room window, which was black, reflecting the normal glare of streetlights. Helen was kind and gentle to me. I never saw the face in the window again. The Man Who Vanished Twice. Ryan Carter had always been good at disappearing. Back in 2009, when his tech startup collapsed, he left behind a pile of debt and a confused fiancée, skipping town without a trace. He resurfaced 2 years later in Denver with a new name, a new company, and a story about backpacking through Europe to find himself. No one questioned it. He was charming, smart, and, most importantly, successful again. But in 2023, Ryan vanished for the second time. This time, it was different. He had a wife, a mortgage, and a thriving cybersecurity business that catered to high-profile clients. He wasn't the type to ghost anyone anymore. At least, that's what his wife, Lauren, told the police when she reported him missing. It started on a Thursday. Ryan had a meeting with a potential investor at a boutique hotel downtown. He kissed Lauren goodbye, grabbed his laptop bag, and walked out the door. Security footage confirmed he made it to the meeting. He was seen shaking hands with the investor in the lobby, then heading up to a private conference room. The investor left 45 minutes later, alone. Ryan never came out. At first, the police suspected foul play. Maybe a robbery gone wrong, maybe a business deal turned deadly, but there was no evidence of a struggle, no blood, no signs of forced entry or exit. His phone was last pinged in the hotel, then it went dark, his credit cards untouched, his car still parked in the garage. It was as if he had walked into that room and simply ceased to exist. Then Lauren received an email. It was from Ryan's personal account. No subject line, no message, just a single attachment. A blurry security camera still from inside the hotel's service hallway. It showed Ryan slipping out a side door. His expression was unreadable. He was carrying his laptop bag, alone. When the police checked the hotel's security footage, that clip didn't exist in their system. Someone had erased it. That's when things got really strange. Lauren started digging into Ryan's past, retracing his steps from before they met. Old business partners described him as brilliant but elusive, always operating under different LLCs, never staying anywhere for too long. One even swore he saw Ryan in San Diego just 2 years before he reappeared in Denver. Another claimed Ryan had used a different last name when they worked together. Then she found something chilling. An old article from 2010, a missing persons report. The man in the grainy photo looked exactly like Ryan, but the name beneath it wasn't his. David Ellis. David Ellis had vanished from Boston in 2009 under mysterious circumstances. No family, no records past a certain point, just gone. Lauren brought this to the police, but by then, Ryan David was long gone. His bank accounts were drained, his social security number led nowhere, and every trace of him vanished like smoke body. No goodbye. Just a man who had disappeared twice. A stranger in my son's eyes. I should have never ignored the warnings about this house. Hi, I am Matt, a 28-year-old single father to my son Ethan, who is 8 years old. He was an unplanned child, and because of this, his mother gave him to me and left our lives. From then on, I have tried to be the best father I could be for Ethan. I work as a waiter in a restaurant for minimum wage, which makes it extremely difficult for me to earn enough money for both of us. We lived in a rented house, but day by day, our landlord made it impossible to live peacefully. He would increase the rent without notice and blame me for damages in the house, even though they were there before we moved in. So when I heard that a house was for sale at a very cheap price, I knew it was our ticket out of this hellhole. But I couldn't have been more wrong. When I went to check the house with the dealer, the neighbors were all whispering, and even the dealer looked nervous. I asked him if there was any problem with the house, and he told me that the last person who lived there had been arrested for some serious crimes. I didn't inquire further and said, who cares about the previous owner? I sealed the deal and bought the house. The first few days were nice. Ethan got his own room and was overjoyed. But one thing I noticed was that whenever I tried to talk to my neighbors, they would rush into their homes, making up excuses to avoid conversation. I brushed it off as them just being rude. The dealer had told me something extremely serious while selling the house. He warned me that there was a basement, but I should never go there, nor should my son. His face looked extremely serious, so I obeyed him without asking questions. I told my son never to go into the basement. I saw rebellion on his face, but he promised me he wouldn't go there. Then came the day. It was a Saturday night, and the restaurant was extremely busy. I told my son that it would take me some time to get home and that he should eat dinner without me and go to sleep. I returned home from my shift exhausted. I went to his room and saw that he wasn't there. Panic rushed over me as I started screaming his name and searching throughout the house. That's when I saw him coming up from the basement. He looked at me with a devilish smile and blank eyes and told me there was nothing in the basement. I knew something was wrong just by looking at his face, but I didn't push it. I simply told him to go to his room and sleep. I was not in the mood to eat. I went to my room and plummeted onto my bed. I couldn't shake his expression from my mind. He looked evil. And even though I don't want to admit it, I was scared of my own son. The next day, I started noticing changes in his behavior. He didn't eat breakfast, even though I kept insisting. Then, out of nowhere, he shouted at me to mind my own business. I didn't say anything to him after that. It was my day off, and every Sunday we used to go to the park together, but today he didn't ask me to take him. Images of him from the previous night flashed through my mind. I tried to brush them off, but I couldn't. I decided to check on him, but once again, he wasn't in his room. This time, I didn't call his name. I slowly walked towards the basement and saw that the door was open. I peeked inside, and there he was, my son, crouching and eating something off the floor. It was really dark, making it difficult for my eyes to adjust. But then I saw it. There was a dead body on the floor, and he was eating it. A gasp escaped from my mouth, and I quickly covered it, but it was too late. His head turned 180 degrees. He saw me, smiled, and said, "You saw everything, Dad. You must go now." He screamed in anger and leapt towards me. I tried to reason with him, but he wouldn't budge. He bit my arm hard. I screamed as blood poured from the wound. Gathering my strength, I kicked him hard enough that he flew back into the basement. I quickly slammed the door shut and locked it from the outside, buying myself some time. I knew I couldn't run to the main door. It was too far and he was too fast. He would catch up to me quickly. So I ran to my room instead. There was one thing I hadn't told my son about this house, a secret ladder that led to the attic, accessible from my room. I pulled it open, climbed up, and pulled the ladder back up. That's when I heard a loud crash. He had broken down the basement door and was searching for me. Desperate for answers, I searched for the history of this house. What I found shocked me. The previous owner's name was Mark. He was a serial killer who seduced women, brought them to his house, killed them, and ate them. One woman managed to escape and reported him to the police. They came and arrested him, but as they were taking him to the car, he ran back into the basement and killed himself with a knife. Now I am certain Mark has possessed my son. I know I can't hide here much longer. This was his house. He knows about the attic. So now I am here, typing this post, begging for help. I can't call anyone. The noise would give away my position. Someone please save me before he finds me. My mom used to collect all my baby teeth, but now I'm an adult, but her collection keeps on growing. My mom always liked to collect the teeth that fell out when I was a child. I'm not entirely sure as to why she wanted to keep them, but I didn't really think too much either. It was just something that she did. I remember that she would always claim that it was bad luck to throw away a tooth. She was a very superstitious woman, and growing up with her, some of that rubbed off on me. She kept all of my teeth inside of a small wooden box with a coat of chipping red paint. Inside, red velvet lined the bottom and sides of the box, creating a soft interior for the teeth to lay on. She kept this square box inside of the top drawer of her bedside table. I only ever saw this box make an appearance when I would lose another tooth, and she would go get the box and put the tooth into it. Other than that, it stayed hidden within her drawer. I never really thought about the box and my missing teeth. I forgot it even existed until yesterday. I recently moved out of my mom's house, and so was in the process of moving all of my stuff out and into my new apartment. I entered my former home and residence of my mother as ready to pack up the final few items that still needed moving. My mom was sitting at her kitchen table, wearing long pants, a thick sweater, and woolly pink gloves. It was a strange sight to behold due to the fact that it was a warm day, but she is an eccentric woman, so I dismissed it. I greeted her, and she looked up at me and made a small grunt-like noise that I assumed meant hello. She was sometimes a bit dismissive, especially because she wasn't too happy about me moving out. I continued on into the house, grabbing whatever was left of my stuff. I grabbed some clothes, a bottle of shampoo, and a couple of photo frames. I then remembered the old wooden box of old teeth. I didn't have any real reason for wanting to take it with me, but I guess I didn't want to risk any bad luck by not bringing it along. I wandered into my mom's room, which I know I probably shouldn't have done. I walked over to her nightstand and was just about to open it when I remembered that I should ask her permission before snooping through her things. I called out to my mother, who was still situated in the kitchen. "Hey, Mom, is it all right if I grab that box you keep my teeth in?" I yelled out. "It's in your top drawer. There's nothing I shouldn't see in there, is there?" I awaited a response from Mom. I swore I heard a slight grunting noise that vaguely sounded like a yes. So, maybe stupidly, I opened the top drawer and plucked out the small box that sat atop a pile of old photographs. I opened the box, expecting to see around 20 teeth sitting within its wooden grasp. As I lifted the lid, I immediately saw that the box was filled to the brim with teeth. Not just baby teeth, but full-sized adult teeth as well. There had to be at least 100 pearly whites all piled on top of each other. As I stared down into the box, I heard a noise behind me, like a soft grunting sound. I spun around sharply and saw my mom standing right there. She made another muffled sound, and I noticed that her mouth didn't open. Something was definitely wrong. First, she was only making noises and not talking, and second, she was collecting teeth that didn't belong to me. What's going on? Whose teeth are these, and what are you doing with them? I asked in a tone that commanded an answer. She stared at me, and her eyes provided me with some sort of answer. She was afraid. I could see it by just looking into her eyes. But was she afraid that I'd just discovered her horrible little secret, or afraid because something dark and terrible was happening to her? She then opened her mouth, which gave me a much more detailed explanation. As her lips parted, I saw a normal row of teeth sitting along her gums. She then opened her mouth more, slightly tilting her head backwards as she did, and it revealed another row of teeth behind. They were jutting out of the roof of her mouth. Her entire mouth was filled with perfectly white teeth. I then noticed that the bottom of her mouth also had teeth growing out of it. Along the sides of her tongue, teeth sprouted and protruded upwards. I let out a small yelp, both surprised and scared of what I had just seen. She looked into my eyes, expecting this reaction. She then lifted both hands, grasped a gloved hand with the other, and slid her left hand mitten off. The sight of a hand absolutely covered in teeth is not one that I ever expected to witness in my life, but here it was. Covering her entire hand and onto her wrist, numerous teeth emerged from underneath the skin, poking through like sprouts growing out of dirt. Her hand was covered in the enamel growths, and no skin was visible underneath the teeth. My stomach heaved at the sight, probably both in disgust and genuine terror. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Mum took off the other glove, revealing an identical hand made up of teeth that had broken through the surface of her skin. Sensing my feeling of revulsion, I would have thought Mum would have stopped there, but she took off the woolly jumper, uncovering the rows of teeth that sat along her entire arms. Her chest area also sprouted teeth, but they were still mostly underneath the skin, like they hadn't fully grown through yet. Not like the rest of her body. I didn't need to see it, but I assumed that her legs would also be covered in the teeth. I watched on in horror as I saw one of the teeth near her shoulder wobble. It wobbled only slightly, but I could tell that it was loose. She had a loose tooth on her shoulder. The wobbling continued, and I saw the tooth begin to push its way out of her skin. It gave a final wobble before falling to the floor, completely its life cycle. I couldn't help but stand there, frozen in fear at what was occurring. I didn't know what to do. I knew I should try and help her, but shock wouldn't allow me. Not just yet. Mum then turned around and walked out of her bedroom. I stood for a moment longer before following, rather apprehensively. When I caught up to her, she was sat back down at the kitchen table, one tooth-covered arm resting on the table, the other clutched a pen. I'm not sure how she managed to hold a pen, but I knew it must have been painful to bend her fingers around it, as it would stretch the skin underneath the teeth. She must have fought through this pain because she held the pen and she brought it down to a piece of paper that was sitting on the kitchen table. She began to write. I approached the table, curious as to what was being written. I was terrified at this point and hoped that she was providing more answers as to what was happening to her. I walked up the piece of paper and started to read. What she had written was the most terrifying thing so far. I know you are scared. I was too when I found your grandmother in this state. She looked awful, just as I do now. She didn't know what was happening to her, but luckily death came quickly to her to stop this suffering. I never expected it to happen to me. I prayed that it never would. Yet, here I am, plagued by the same affliction as my mother. I'm sorry to tell you this, but I think it might be hereditary. If you think you saw something, no you didn't. That's the first rule they teach you in these woods, especially as a forest ranger. It's not some quirky saying, it's the rule. You learn fast that the things you think you see are better left buried deep in the back of your mind. Because when you start asking questions about those things, when you start telling people about them, bad things happen. real bad. I've been a ranger for almost 5 years now, and I'd like to say that I have a handle on things. The forest is peaceful, a place to lose yourself, to think. Sure, there's the occasional weird noise in the distance, the rustling of leaves in the dead of night when there's no wind, the flicker of movement out of the corner of your eye, but that's just nature, right? Well, 2 weeks into my job, I found out firsthand why we have that rule. I was doing my regular rounds, checking the perimeter, making sure the trail markers were still intact and that the cabins were locked up tight. The usual stuff. There's a trail about 5 miles into the woods that people like to hike. A perfect place for a little solitude and quite picturesque. It's calm out there, quiet. You don't expect anything to happen in a place like that. But that day, something felt off. The trees felt taller, the air heavier. It was a late afternoon, and while the sun should have been setting soon, it felt like it was setting faster than usual. I shook it off, focused on the job. As I was picking up an empty bag of chips from the trail, the wind picked up, making the trees sway and creak. But then, something caught my eye. Just off the path, I saw movement, a figure. It wasn't a person, but it also didn't look like any animal I've seen. A silhouette shifting behind the trees, like far enough that I couldn't make out details, but close enough that I knew it was there. My heart skipped a beat, but I forced myself to think it was just some lost hiker, maybe an animal moving in the underbrush. I called out, but the forest swallowed my voice, the wind carrying it away. I stepped off the path and approached the area where I thought I'd seen it, but when I reached the spot, there was nothing, just woods, silent and empty. I searched for a few seconds but found no footprints, no signs of anyone or anything being there just a few moments ago. I started walking back toward the trail, and then I heard it. Footsteps behind me, light, as if someone was following just a few paces behind. My pulse quickened. I turned to see who or what it was. Nothing. I'm not an idiot. I knew better than to ignore it, so I quickened my pace. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, a trick of the mind, but the footsteps didn't stop. They stayed right there, shadowing mine, perfectly in sync. And then it stopped. The sudden silence, minus the crunch of my boots on the trail, made the whole situation even more terrifying. I paused for a moment, too scared of what may happen if I turned around now. So many choices ran through my head until I decided on one. Well, I wouldn't say I decided, more like my body chose for me. A surge of adrenaline pushed me to start speed walking back to the ranger station. Something in me screaming that if I started running, I'd be dead. My heart pounded, as if I was in a marathon, with each stride goosebumps formed. The crisp wind moving my hair to my face and carried the scent of vanilla through the air. The smell reminding me that any animal could find where I am, especially the thing following. I reached the station and locked the door. After a few minutes of nothing, I sat behind the desk, chuckling at myself for getting all worked up and for believing the other rangers' stories. A couple of them even went as far as to claim they saw stuff. At first, I thought they were just trying to mess with the new guy and get him all scared before the first watch. In that moment of giggling at their stories, I realized one of them is lining up exactly like what happened outside. The following footsteps, the feeling of being stared down, the shadow. Even the time of year is exactly when they said it happened. Trying to clear my mind from that, I decided to examine the trail cam footage on the old monitor. It was the most peaceful part of the job, just stare at the footage and take notes of the animals. A bit too peaceful given the fact I fell asleep in front of the screen for a little. A loud noise jolted me out of my sleep, causing me to fall out of the chair. I picked myself off the floor and walked over to the window to investigate. Flipping on the floodlights outside the cabin, a large branch lying just in front of the porch. At first, I brushed it off. It's a forest, and branches break all the time, only to immediately remember the fact the station is in the middle of a small clearing. The only way a branch that size would end up here is during a hurricane, and it most certainly was not raining. A multitude of reasons raced through my head, anything that could rationally explain how this hunk of wood got there. I walked away from the window over to the coffee bar, landing on the reason being a giant gust of wind flinging the branch to its spot. Taking a sip of my coffee and quietly humming to myself, I situate myself back into the semi-comfortable computer chair. A few more reports later, and I'm back to watching the cameras and naming new faces. A sow, Moon, gave birth earlier in the year, and the rangers fell in love with the two cubs due to their fur, making it look like Light has eyebrows and Shine has a little mustache. So one of my duties tonight is to try and spot them and update their information. After 3 hours, I almost gave up hope, but then I saw movement around the cave Moon had chosen as her home for 4 years in a row. But it wasn't her. It looked almost like a deer, only the deer was trying to act human. Standing on its two hind legs and with a hunched back, it walked around the flattened area. Its eyes glowing bright in the night vision lens every time it looks in the direction of the camera. Then it paused, sniffed in the air, and looked straight at the camera. I jumped back, shocked at the accurate eye contact made through the screen. I readjusted my chair and continued to watch whatever this thing was, writing down every detail I could get while it was still visible. The creature started walking towards the tree that the camera was perched on, its steps slow and deliberate. Once it reached the trunk, the thing raised its hands to the bark and started shoving. Each push causes the tree, and therefore the camera, to shake immensely. I stood up and pushed the chair back, the fear truly setting in. Quickly grabbing the walkie on my belt, I call into the closest station near me. Surely someone else is seeing this. The only problem was all the channels I tried were off, or at least that's what I assumed. At the time, it didn't make sense. When the fifth station was also static, I gave up that plan. I looked back at the screen and see the creature's shoving had only gotten more aggressive. By the looks of it, the poplar was rocking back and forth at this point. Then just in the distance, the loud sounds of groaning, cracking, and popping cut through the air. Moments later, a loud crash followed and the camera was no longer in signal. With no other plan in mind, I scribbled the events unfolding into the notebook. Semi-worried no one would believe me. Semi-worried this will be the pages that the police would find for evidence. The chaos didn't stop there. Not even 10 minutes later, another trail cam, the one filming the trail I checked earlier, showed movement. This activity was different though. The dark shape moving quickly, too quickly, back and forth in front of the camera, as if it was playing with it. I continued my notes until I glanced up and saw it staring right at me again. Its face closer than before, close enough that I could truly see what creature was out there. It wasn't a deer, not completely anyway. Its head was shaped like a German shepherd's and eyes sat too close at the front of its face, once again glowing in the night vision. The sight of this thing making me scream. I slap my hands over my mouth and stare at the computer screen. The creature was now looking in the direction of the cabin. My eyes clenched shut as a few tears run down my face, the fear taking complete hold of me. Quiet sobs left my mouth as I checked the camera once again. It's gone. You'd expect my reaction to be relief. It was not. To the depth of my core, I knew it wasn't really gone. All I could think was, it's coming here. It's coming for me. I started rummaging through the drawers of the desk, wincing at every squeak of the steel as they open. In the left bottom drawer, I found a spiral notebook with no cover page, the first thing written talking about specific animals to avoid due to temperament. I almost tossed it aside, but the loose cover page at the bottom of the drawer caught my eye. In case of all emergencies. At this point, anything could help, plus this should count as one of the emergencies. Right? Thank God for whoever was looking out for me, because on the second page in the notebook, I learned there's a specific flare gun behind the antique picture of the forest. I run over to the wall and take down the picture, setting it on the mantle of the fireplace. And just like the notebook said, a small recessed shelf hidden behind the picture held a red flare gun with 3 rounds sitting next to it. Realizing I neglected to read what to do with the flare, I hurry over to the book again and see at the bottom in red, in the case of unique emergencies, fire 3 shots into the sky. The sound of leaves crunching loudly catches my attention and breath. I stand there, paralyzed in terror, unsure of what to do. I can't go outside. I can't fire it in here. If I open a window to fire, it will definitely get to me before I could shoot the second, let alone the third. The lack of options getting to my head, I began to pace back and forth. Then, The steps outside stilled, replacing the sound with jagged breathing. Through the monitor, I can see the creature was standing in the middle of the small gravel parking lot, staring at the station with its head tilting ever so slightly. I run into the back office, flare gun and cartridges in hand, and lock the doorknob and the two deadbolt locks. I always thought these were for bear attacks, but it seems situations like these have happened before. Looking around the tattered office, I hoped to find anything that could help me. I noticed that the light hadn't been turned on and looked up to see a skylight with a small black handle. I grabbed the stepladder and reached for the handle to see which way it opens. Twisting it slowly, I gently push up and it doesn't budge. The bookcase in the office was at the perfect height and spot to sit with your foot on the step stool for balance, so I did just that. I pushed a little harder, but it still didn't budge. On a whim, I tried pulling it open, and it worked. Pulling the cartridges out of my pocket, I opened the window just enough to aim the flares at the sky. I load the first one and aim it at the moon. One down. With the other two in my hand, I quickly reload another cartridge and squeeze the trigger. 2. One more to go. The sound of a loud stomp from the roof almost caused me to drop the last round. I quickly caught it and shoved the round into the flare gun. The sound of heavy footsteps nearing me, raising my adrenaline and causing me to shake. I aim at the moon again and pull. Last one. Help is coming. I slam the window shut and twist the handle to lock, just as the creature jumped into view. It stared at me through the glass, its eyes wide enough to see the whites. The thing opened its mouth into what I can only assume was a smile, revealing unnaturally sharp teeth, opened its mouth, and let out a scream I would describe as a shrieking whistle. I cower and end up falling off the bookshelf, my landing cushioned by the scattered reports and other papers. Groaning, I pull myself into the fetal position and wait for one of two things. Help comes and somehow rescues me. This thing makes me its next meal. The sound of hooves slamming on the glass had me leaning toward the latter being more realistic. I rock myself, each slam of its hooves making me wince. It didn't take long for the sound of the glass starting to crack to fill the air. I hold my breath, unprepared for what horror lay in store. Then I heard it, the sound of multiple vehicles from all around the cabin swiftly pulling up, and the stomping stopped. Sounds of car doors slamming and 3 gunshots rang in the air. I looked up at the skylight, and the creature was gone. The rangers from the other station banged on the front doors. It took me a minute to compose myself, then I let them in. Immediately they asked me what happened. I told them everything that happened as best I could, and showed them my notebook for my details. I asked what that thing was, and they said it's best if I don't ask things I don't want to know. Next time, ignore it. A ranger chuckled out and playfully threw his arms on my shoulders. Remember the golden rule, if you think you see something, no you don't. I live by those words and have kept out of trouble for the most part these past years. So if you're reading this, consider it as an example of why we have this rule, and good luck. A phone booth appeared outside my house. When I answered it, I heard a familiar voice. I wasn't sure who put it there, but a phone booth appeared outside my house. I hadn't seen one in years and thought they were phased out. I wasn't even sure what use it would be when I always had my phone on me. I didn't give it much notice until it started ringing late one night. I had no intention of getting out of bed to answer it. The ringing lasted all night and only stopped when the sun started to come up. The following night, the phone started ringing again at the same time as before. I tried to ignore it, but something told me it was urgent. I put on my coat before heading out into the cold night air. I stood in the confines of the booth and picked up the receiver and placed it to my ear. "Hello, who is this?" I asked. At first, all I could hear was an ear-piercing, crackling sound before it went silent. "Hello, my name is Marianne. What's yours?" said the voice of a young girl. I felt uneasy about the whole situation and didn't think it was safe to give my real name, which, strangely enough, was Marianne. "My name is Suzanne. How old are you, Marianne?" I asked. "It's my 10th birthday today. I really like your name. It's the same name my mother has." I felt a cold chill up my spine because that was also my late mother's name. "How did you find this number?" I asked. The phone went silent for a moment before I heard shouting on the other end of the phone. "That's my dad. I need to go," said the girl with a hint of fear in her voice. The phone suddenly went dead, and all I could hear was static on the other end. The next night, as I lay in bed, I thought I must have dreamt it all. It was all just too surreal for it to have happened, but just as I was about to close my eyes, the phone rang again. The booth kept me dry from the relentless rain that was pouring down. I picked up the handset and was greeted with the same sweet voice from before. "Is this you, Suzanne?" said the little girl. "It is, Marianne. How are you tonight?" I asked. The little girl let out a deep sigh over the phone. "I'm sad. My dad was angry with me for being up late last night." "I'm sorry to hear that, Marianne. My dad used to be mean to me all the time as well," I explained. "Did you used to hide as well?" asked the little girl. Tears streamed down my face as memories I had buried deep in my subconscious began to resurface. "I used to hide in the cupboard under the stairs," I said as I wiped the tears from my face. "How are you able to ring me?" I asked. "My mom bought me a dream phone for my birthday, and when I dialed one of the numbers, you answered." Getting a dream phone was one of the few happy memories I had as a child. The phone was off limits, and if I was caught using it, I would have taken a beating. So when my mom bought me the dream phone for my birthday, I remembered feeling so grown up even though it wasn't real. The following day, I couldn't stop thinking about Marianne. I thought what was happening was some kind of psychotic break, but crazy people don't normally think they are crazy. I pulled a box from my attic. It contained things from childhood, including diaries I had kept growing up. I wasn't sure why I kept onto it because I had so many bad memories attached to it. I flipped through one of the diaries I had written in around the time I was Marianne's age. I flipped to the entries I had made around my 10th birthday. A feeling of dread crept up my spine as I read what I had written all those years ago. "Suzanne seems so nice, and we have a lot in common." My hands suddenly began to tremble as I read out the next passage. "Suzanne used to hide under the stairs like me when she was young. Her daddy was mean too." That night, I sat up waiting for the call. As soon as the phone rang, I ran straight out to the phone booth. When I answered, Marianne was crying on the phone, and I could hear a man shouting aggressively in between loud bangs. "What's happening, Marianne?" I asked. "My dad is drunk, and he's fighting with my mom. I'm scared, Suzanne. What will I do?" she asked as her voice trembled with fear. "You need to put down the phone and run to your safe place." "What about my mom?" "He's hurting her." I remember those nights so vividly now when my dad would beat my mother relentlessly, but I also remember when he was bored of beating her. He turned his anger on me. "Your mom is going to be okay. You need to get to the spot under the stairs." I could hear the screaming getting louder as if he was making his way to Marianne's room. "How do you know that's where I hide?" she asked. "That doesn't matter. You need to go now." Suddenly, the phone went silent, and all I could do was pray she made it to her hiding place safely. I opened my old diary and flipped the pages. I remembered the date clearly because the fear I felt all those years ago was now raw in my mind. Tonight, my dad was worse than ever, but thanks to Suzanne, I made it to my safe place. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I could clearly remember writing it. Yet, I couldn't remember talking to Suzanne, or in this case, myself. I flicked the page to a passage I wrote the night my life changed forever. It was the night my dad killed my mom and tried to kill me. For the little girl on the phone, that date was tomorrow night. This time, I waited in the phone booth for the phone to ring. It felt like I was back there the night it happened. My chest felt tight as if all the air was sucked from the booth and I could hardly breathe. I picked up the receiver before it had time to ring twice. "Marianne, are you all right?" I asked. "I made it to my safe place, just like you told me to." I couldn't help but smile. "You are so brave, Marianne. I'm so happy you are okay." "My dad has been acting even stranger today, and my mom has been crying all day. I think she needs to go to the hospital." Suddenly, vivid memories of that night invaded my mind. Right before my dad went crazy, I remembered him singing "Tonight's the Night" by Neil Young as he wandered through the house looking for my mother. Just like all those years ago, I could hear my dad sing that awful song through the phone. I knew Marianne needed to act now. Marianne, I need you to be brave one more time. This time, you need to go outside and run to a neighbor's house and beg them to call the police. Tell them your dad is killing your mother. Just as she was about to say something, I screamed at her to run before the phone suddenly went quiet. I went back to the house and picked up my old diary. As I flicked to the next page and read the next passage, I was suddenly overcome with emotion. This time, it was a happiness I'd never felt before. I was a brave girl last night. I ran to the neighbors, just like Suzanne asked, and the police came and arrested my dad. I'm at my aunt's now while my mom gets better at the hospital. That night, I dreamt of a life I never got to live. It was filled with happy memories of my mother as she got older. When I woke the following morning, the phone booth had disappeared. I was filled with mixed emotions and was sad I wasn't going to get to talk to Marianne anymore. I wanted to hear her voice and tell me everything was all right. As I sat there drying my tears, my mobile phone rang. I picked it up and began to shake as I looked at the caller ID, which read, Mom. My hands trembled as I pressed the answer button. Hey Marianne, I'm just wondering if you are calling tonight. I'm cooking your favorite. My name is Allison and I'm a Snuff film star. Now I don't have the source for the movies, and before you ask, it's not mainstream porn you can find by just Googling my name. They're videos of me being murdered. Where would you even find those types of videos? The dark web, maybe? I don't know. I don't like watching myself being murdered. What I can tell you is, I've starred in over 50 movies, and according to the guy who distributes them, I'm the most watched and most sought-after snuff star in history, if that's even a thing. You're probably wondering how one would even get into that business. Well, the short answer is by accident. You don't wake up one day and decide you want to be murdered. In my case, I answered an ad looking for an amateur porn actress. I was just starting out in the business and the pay seemed reasonable. When I arrived at the location, which was a house in an upmarket location, it didn't raise any red flags. It all seemed legit until I asked to be paid up front, and the response was, let's see how you die first. Before I knew it, I was being held down and the cameras began rolling. All I can say is dying is like going to sleep during surgery. It's painful at the start and scary, but when your heart starts slowing down, you get a rush of euphoria and everything goes silent before the lights go out. I couldn't tell if there was an afterlife. I don't stay dead long enough to find out. It's like going to sleep without dreaming. There's a nanosecond of darkness before you wake up again. You would think that a guy whose business is death would be easily scared. But when I suddenly woke up as they were loading me into a shallow grave in the woods, he screamed like a little girl. It took some time to calm him down. You would swear it was him that was just brutally murdered with the way he reacted. But once the initial shock wore off, he looked me dead in the eye, no pun intended, and said, I'm gonna make you a fucking star. I can't go into details on how I get snuffed out, but I can say the money is great. More than I could ever make being in mainstream porn. The problem isn't the fact that my employer is a death dealer of women. Actually, no women have been murdered apart from me, of course, since I started. The problem is the reaction I'm starting to get the more my popularity grows. The surprising thing is, the people who notice me are the most ordinary people you could imagine, not monsters that hide away in the shadows fantasizing about murdering women. I mean school teachers, doctors, and even young teenagers. The biggest shock for me was when I was sitting in a cafe and I was approached by a young dad who had his 2 young daughters with him. He sat staring at me while his daughters sat eating chocolate muffins. I knew why he was looking at me, even if he didn't. As I was finishing up my latte, I looked up to see him standing next to me with a strange grin on his face. Do I know you from somewhere? He suddenly asked. I was in my comfort clothes. A baggy t-shirt with a pair of sweatpants and the tattoo of a pentagram on my arm was on show. He began studying me to figure out how he knew me, and when I was just about to speak, he noticed the tattoo on my arm. It was like a light switched on in his brain, and he suddenly realized where he knew me from. His face turned deathly pale, and he began to stutter a bit before he hurried himself and his daughters out of the cafe. I was never really worried about being noticed before. because the men that watched me expected me to be dead. I also never gave a second thought to my tattoo being the thing that gave me away. I mean, how many girls out there have the same tattoo? When I got it done, I was told it was a popular choice. That all changed when I got a phone call from my mother. My poor mother had no clue about the type of business I was in. She always thought I was into some lifestyle stuff, like a trainer to the stars or something. I think the dream was better than the reality. She always told her friends I was a successful businesswoman of some sort. Technically, she wasn't wrong. All that changed when she rang me in hysterics. She could barely contain herself over the phone. "You're alive. You're alive," is all she kept on repeating down the phone. After I calmed her down and reassured her I was very much alive, I waited until her breathing had slowed to a more relaxed state. "Allison." For a moment, I thought I was speaking to a ghost. My mother was always my biggest fan in life, and it broke my heart to hear her this upset. "The police were here. Men in suits, detectives, I think. They told me you were dead." "Oh, my sweet girl, they told me you were dead. They had found blood and something about a tape or the internet. The bastards gave me a heart attack. I knew you weren't dead." That night, I went to stay with my mother, just to reassure her that I was still physically present and to just hug her. Mainly to reassure myself that I was definitely still present in this world. Deep down, I knew what this was about. Of course, someone who wasn't a degenerate monster was going to watch my movies and try to put a name on the woman who should be somewhere in a shallow grave. But I always thought people would think the movies were just great fakes, because you can only be the star of one Snuff movie, not 50. A few weeks had passed, and apart from my mother losing a year or two of her life, things had settled down. I had decided to quit. It was never going to be a long-term thing. But if I was going to stop, my final movie was going to be my best. Go out with a bang, I always say. It was the day of the shoot, and on the way to the location, I couldn't escape the feeling I was being watched. I put it down to my nerves because I was going to die in the most brutal way possible. It was going to be so bad, no one was ever going to think it was faked. And the fact it was going to be the last video of me made it sound all the more believable. I knew it was going to be painful, but the pain never lasted, and all I was thinking was, it's going to be a spectacular death, and it was. But as the euphoria swept over me and I began to slip into the darkness, I watched as men in SWAT gear burst into the room, followed by men in suits. As always, I came back to life with a big gasp of air, like a baby taking its first breath after being expelled from the womb. I was expecting to be in the room where I was murdered, but this time I found myself on a cold metal slab. As I looked around what looked like an operating room, I saw two men in suits. One was smiling while the other appeared to hand over money from his wallet. "Hi, welcome back. I just bet my colleague $50 that you would come back from the dead," he said as he put the note into his top pocket. "I must say I am a big fan of your movies. Damsel in the Dungeon is my personal favorite," said the smartly dressed man as he smiled down at me. This was the first time I had ever felt in danger. A sudden panic washed over me as I tried to get up off the table. The two men in suits smiled at each other before handing me a hospital gown. "Where am I?" I asked nervously. "You have nothing to worry about. It's not like we are going to kill you," said one of the men as they burst out laughing. The two men walked me to an interview room and sat me down at a table opposite them. "You still haven't told me who you are and my reasons for being here." The two men adjusted themselves into a more serious posture. "Sorry for the confusion. My name is Agent Harris and my colleague here is Agent Butler." I look across at the two young agents sitting across from me as their frozen expressions fixate on me. "Agents? Are you FBI or something?" I nervously asked. One of the agents gave a disgruntled laugh as if I offended him. "Close, we're with the CIA." "What do you want with me?" I didn't know dying was illegal. The two men sat upright as one of them put a picture of a woman in front of me. "We need your help with a delicate situation. It's of the utmost importance to the security of this country." I looked down at the picture of a woman who looked strangely enough like me. Apart from her expensive-looking attire and different colored hair, we had the same facial features and we looked to be the same height. The woman in the picture is the wife of the Russian Minister for Defense, Sergei Shoigu, said the agent with a sound of urgency in his voice. What does this have to do with me? I asked. She has a lot of secrets that could be very important to us. The problem is her husband isn't a nice man. Fortunately for us, he treats her like a dog, so she wants a way out of the marriage, but being the man he is, he's not going to let her go so easily. I still don't get what this has to do with me. The two agents look at each other before fixating their stares at me again. Sergei is a very powerful man. Even if we got her out of the country, we couldn't guarantee her safety. The only way we could do that is if we faked her death, but it has to look convincing. And that is where you come in. It suddenly began to make sense. I remember a guy friend of mine who was big into conspiracy theories and would always bang on about how the moon landings were faked in a studio. So would I be correct in thinking you want me to make another movie given my special talent? The two agents look at each other again, but this time with a smile. She catches on quick. I'm beginning to like her already. I picked up the picture again and stared at the woman looking back at me with pain in her eyes and a painted-on smile. How much does this gig pay? Came across an incredibly creepy family a while back. Okay, I never really post anything on Reddit, mostly just reading, so please excuse me if I do or say anything that isn't common courtesy here. In around 2018-2019, I, 25F at the time was 18-19, was living in Nebraska where I grew up. I lived in the largest city in NE, but it was still essentially surrounded by corn and wheat fields. The city was expanding. So rich folks started building huge houses with giant properties on the edge of town as things proceeded to grow. All of that being said, I had a good friend whose parents' house was one of those big ones, right on the blurring line between the fields and the city. My friends and I were constantly hanging out at his place because it was fun. They had tons of property to ride 4x4s on, a hot tub, a huge living room for us to watch sports and have reality TV binge sessions, etc. Plus, his parents were super cool and we could drink out there as long as we stayed at the house. It was tons of fun, even though I am quite scared of the dark. So I would just not go outside after a certain time because there was little lighting and the nearest neighbor was about a mile away. I always felt a weird energy driving from his place if it was late at night, but never had anything happen until one night. The drive out there was a long, winding, two-way road that had thick trees on both sides, and you pass one of the city's largest cemeteries on the way. Barely any lighting, of course, besides the street lamps every once in a while, and very little traffic. It's all inherently a bit creepy, and I'll admit to having sped through this section of road many times to get through it as quickly as possible. This specific night was perfect spring weather, so I was driving with my windows down listening to music, and it was around 10 p.m. I was coming around one of the curves in the road when I had to essentially slam my brakes on. Right in front of me, in the middle of the road, maybe 50 yards away, was what looked like a family. Again, picture a completely pitch-black road with thick forest on both sides and only my headlights to show what's in front of me. This was a family of 4, a tall, slim woman, an average height weight man, a child, short hair but couldn't tell the gender based on the clothing and couldn't see their face, maybe around 8 years old, and the mother was pushing a fucking stroller. Their clothes looked normal, not tattered, but not nice. They also were not carrying any kind of light source, meaning before I arrived behind them in my car, they had been walking in the pitch black. They were all facing away from me, walking completely silent in the middle of the street, the same direction I was heading. I had turned my music down to hear if they were speaking, had music playing, etc. They didn't. The hairs on my arms immediately stood up. I came to a stop in the road behind them, obviously, and just sat there for a moment to let them move. They seemed to be completely unaffected by me and didn't even turn their heads slightly, nor did they attempt to move out of my way. I literally thought I was going insane or that I was dreaming. It was so surreal. Before I really had time to fully process and register what I was seeing and how truly strange it was, they all, at the same time, stopped walking and very slowly turned to face my car. This scared the absolute shit out of me. I honestly didn't even give myself enough time to look at their faces as they turned. I immediately threw my car in reverse and sent it backwards for probably a full 20 seconds before flipping a U-turn, nearly running myself off the road and booking it the other direction. The only thing I remember noticing is that the stroller looked to be completely empty. This was the part that sticks in my mind the most. I've never felt terror like that in my life. I checked my rearview mirror probably 1,000 times before getting to a main road and never saw a glimpse of them. In fact, I never saw a glimpse of them ever again. I tried asking my friend and his family about it, only to essentially feel like I was insane because of the way they looked at me. Every time I tell this story, I get one of three reactions. They immediately think I'm fucking cuckoo, think I'm lying, or have had something sort of similar happen to them. I really don't care if no one believes me, honestly. It was and still is the creepiest thing to ever happen to me. I think about it all the time. It was either some weird-ass family trying to scare the shit out of someone, a distraction for an attempted robbery, assault, etc., or it was something more sinister. I'm gonna tell myself for probably the rest of my life that it was the first option.